An entire city was burned to the ground. Hundreds of people were killed. Thousands were left homeless overnight. And for nearly 50 years, history tried to erase it, scrubbed from textbooks, buried in sealed records, silenced by shame and by power. This is the story of Black Wall Street. This is the story of what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the spring of 1921. And this is the story of why it took the world so long to listen. To understand what was destroyed, you first have to understand what was built. In the early 20th century, in the northern district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, there existed a community unlike almost any other in the United States. It was called Greenwood, and to the people who lived there, it was not just a neighborhood. It was proof that despite the crushing weight of Jim Crow laws, despite segregation and systemic exclusion from white-controlled economies, Black Americans could build something extraordinary entirely on their own terms. Greenwood was home to over 10,000 Black residents. It had its own hotels, its own law firms, its own hospitals, and its own newspapers. There were grocery stores and barber shops, jewelry stores and movie theaters. There were dentists and doctors and lawyers and teachers, all thriving within a few square blocks. Residents circulated their dollars within the community before a single cent left the neighborhood. Some historians estimate that a dollar changed hands as many as 36 times before it ever left Greenwood. Booker T. Washington, visiting the region in 1905, was so struck by the prosperity and self-determination of the Black community in Tulsa that he coined a phrase that would endure for a century. He called it the Negro Wall Street of America. Over time, the world would come to know it simply as Black Wall Street. This was not luck. This was not accident. This was generations of discipline, sacrifice, and collective ambition, forged in the most hostile conditions imaginable. Greenwood was, by any measure, a miracle. But not everyone in Tulsa saw Greenwood as a miracle. Some saw it as a threat. The 1920s in America were a time of deep and violent racial anxiety. The Ku Klux Klan was experiencing a dramatic national revival. In Oklahoma alone, Klan membership surged into the tens of thousands. Racial violence was not an aberration. It was a tool. Between 1877 and 1950, more than 4,000 Black Americans were lynched across the United States. These were not isolated acts of individual hatred. They were organized, public, and often unpunished. In Tulsa, the prosperity of Greenwood created a particular kind of resentment. White residents, many of whom struggled financially, watched Black entrepreneurs flourish just across the railroad tracks, the literal dividing line between the white and Black sections of the city. The railroad tracks were not merely a geographic boundary, they were a psychological one. Newspapers routinely published inflammatory, racially charged language. Black men were characterized as dangerous. Black success was framed as suspicious. The atmosphere in Tulsa was a powder keg, tightly wound, deeply resentful, and waiting for the smallest spark. That spark came on May 30th, 1921. The exact details of what happened that afternoon remain disputed to this day. What is known is this: a 19-year-old Black man named Dick Rowland entered an elevator in a downtown Tulsa building. The elevator was operated by a 17-year-old white woman named Sarah Page. Moments later, Page screamed. Rowland fled. The following morning, the Tulsa Tribune ran a headline that ignited the city: "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." Historians now widely believe the incident was almost certainly a misunderstanding. Perhaps Rowland stumbled and grabbed Page's arm or stepped on her foot. No charges were ever formally filed. Sarah Page herself declined to press charges. But the headline did not wait for facts. By that evening, an armed white mob had gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held. Word spread to Greenwood. Black men, many of them veterans of World War I, men who had fought for a country that still refused to grant them full citizenship, armed themselves and marched to the courthouse to protect Rowland. A confrontation broke out. Shots were fired. And then the city of Tulsa went to war against its own people. Through the night of May 31st and into the morning of June the 1st, white mobs moved through Greenwood like a fire. Homes were set ablaze. Businesses were looted and burned. People were shot in their own doorways, in their yards, in the streets. There are eyewitness accounts and credible historical evidence suggesting that planes flew over the Greenwood district, firing on residents and dropping incendiary devices onto buildings below. In less than 16 hours, 35 blocks of Greenwood were reduced to ash. More than 1,200 homes were destroyed. Estimates of the dead range from 75 to over 300, though the true number may never be known. known. More than 10,000 black residents were left homeless. Many were taken into custody by the very authorities who should have protected them. Black Wall Street was gone. What happened next was a second crime, quieter than the first, but in its own way just as devastating. The survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre came home to nothing. Insurance claims were denied. Lawsuits were dismissed. The city passed emergency ordinances that actually made it harder for black residents to rebuild on their own land. The perpetrators of the violence were never prosecuted. Not one person was ever convicted in connection with the massacre. And then, slowly, deliberately, it was buried. The Tulsa Tribune removed its inflammatory article from its own archive. Official government records were sealed or went missing. The massacre was not discussed in Oklahoma schools. It was absent from state history books for decades. Children grew up in Tulsa without ever being taught what had happened to the neighborhood that once stood blocks from their homes. Survivors were told, in word and in silence, to move on, to forget. Many did not speak of it, not to their children, not to their grandchildren, because the trauma was too deep and the danger of remembering too real. Historian and author Hannibal Johnson, who has spent years documenting the massacre, has described this suppression not as passive neglect, but as active erasure, a coordinated effort to protect the reputations of institutions and individuals who were complicit in what happened. The survivors rebuilt as best they could. Greenwood rose again, partially, painfully, but it was never the same, and the wound it carried was invisible to most of America for generations. The truth, however, has a way of surviving. In 1996, 75 years after the massacre, the state of Oklahoma established the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, later renamed the Tulsa Race Massacre Commission, to formally investigate what had occurred. The commission's final report, released in 2001, confirmed that the massacre had taken place, documented the scale of the destruction, and recommended reparations for survivors and descendants. Those reparations were never paid, but the report cracked something open. Historians, journalists, and educators began to revisit the story. Survivors, those still living, now elderly, voices trembling with age but firm with memory, began to tell their stories publicly. Oral histories were recorded, photographs were recovered, mass grave sites were identified and investigated. In 2019, the centennial of the massacre approaching, the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma made unprecedented public commitments to acknowledgement and accountability. A new Greenwood Rising History Center was opened. The story entered the national curriculum in Oklahoma for the first time. The massacre appeared in mainstream television, in widely read journalism, in the halls of Congress. In 2021, on the 100th anniversary of the massacre, President Joe Biden traveled to Tulsa and became the first sitting United States president to formally acknowledge the Tulsa Race Massacre, standing on the very ground where Black Wall Street once stood. It had taken a century, but the silence, at last, had been broken. History is not a passive thing. It does not simply record what happened. It is shaped by those with power, by those with fear, by those who benefit most from forgetting. The Tulsa Race Massacre was not a footnote. It was not an isolated tragedy in a distant corner of American history. It was a mirror held up to the face of a nation, reflecting the cost of unchecked hatred, of racial terror, and of the silence that allows injustice to become invisible. But it is also a testament to the people of Greenwood, who built something magnificent out of almost nothing, to the survivors who carried the weight of that loss for decades without acknowledgement, to the descendants who refused to let the story die, and to every historian, educator, and truth-teller who understood that a wound hidden is not a wound healed. We cannot undo what was done in Tulsa, but we can choose what we do with the knowing of it. The massacre happened, Black Wall Street existed, and now, finally, the world remembers.